So this week it's emerged with Man City that the 115 charges case is currently paused as closing arguments are to be made next month. How does that impact the timeline of that case?
So I think the key thing is that it's confirmation that the hearing has run effectively the full duration of the 10 to 12 weeks that was predicted or sort of rumored. And it's run from effectively early September all the way through to the end of the year. So from a court perspective, from a kind of arbitration perspective, mid-December is the end of the year. Very, very few trials would go on beyond that sort of end of the second week of December. So this has taken up the full final quarter of the year. Now, what that means is that they've covered an enormous amount of ground. And I think that giving them time, probably, I would think maybe a week, maybe a week and a half to prepare the written closings, which is the normal way in which an English law hearing works. You at the end of the hearing, the parties prepare a written skeleton of what they're going to say in closing, brings together their case, both on the claimant side and also on the defense side. And then they will present that in summary form to the panel in oral hearing, in oral hearing in December. And that'll last maybe each side will have 3 to 4 days each doing that. And then that will be the end. And then we'll go into the period where we wait for the decision. Now, I think the key takeaway from the fact that it's gone this duration is that it's going to take a long time to get the decision, because of the volume of documentation that must have been gone through, the number of witnesses that must have been presenting to the panel. It just means that it's going to take quite a while to get the decision out of this panel. Now, if this was in the courts for something like a 13-week, 12-week trial hearing, it could easily take over a year to get a decision. So you would finish the trial and then you just sit back and wait. And then at some point, a year or more later, the decision comes out. Now, I doubt it will be a year in this case before we get a decision. But likewise, I think it's unlikely now that we're going to get anything before the end of March. And we may not even get a decision, an initial decision, before the end of May. Now, we also understand that from some of the coverage from the Lawyer publication, which is an industry publication for barristers and solicitors, we understand that this is a split hearing. And within that split hearing, that means you're going to have liability to what's going on now. And then if City are found to be liable, then there will be something on sentencing and sanctioning. So even if there's a decision before March, there's still some way to go.
So obviously the other case involving City is the APT battle. We had the vote on that last week. It went in the Premier League's favour. What are the likely next steps with that? Obviously last week we were recording when the decision came out. So after a week, where do you think we're really at with that?
So look, I think the whole process has neither been the extreme that it's the end of football, nor this enormous victory for City. And the exact sort of position along that line will come out over the next few weeks. First thing we need to see is the full drafting of the new rules. Now, I think it's quite surprising, and I did just check, that if you go on the Premier League website, the new set of rules that incorporates what was approved last Friday have still not been published. So I think they're still waiting for the FA's approval before actually publishing that new rule book. I think the other aspect that's also surprising now is that we have had a vote on new rules, but what they haven't done is revisited the rules that were rejected in June at the last annual general meeting regarding closing loopholes on sister transactions. So you may recall that there was a vote put in respect of matters such as Chelsea's hotel sale and other similar kind of intra-group sales, and that was rejected at the AGM. I think they only got 11 votes in favour, and therefore it didn't pass the 2/3 majority was required. But what's interesting is they've gone through a whole load of new amendments and haven't brought those back. So, so the first thing, I think the first thing we need to see is, what does the rule book look like? Okay, all the clubs have obviously seen that, they voted on that, so that's not going to be news to them. But it is going to be news to us, because we're going to see like the fine detail on this stuff. So, for example, we're going to find out how are they going to calculate fair market value on shareholder loans. And one of the things that's going to be interesting on shareholder loans, is it going to be a different rate for each team, or is it going to be a standardized rate? And is that rate going to be Bank of England rate plus whatever, or is it going to be something different? And it's quite important, because if you're Everton, and we'll talk about Everton, I think, in terms of what they've said they're going to do with their loan now, over the last 24 hours, Mashiri's made an announcement or briefed the press about what he's going to do. But if you are an Everton, your interest rate on that loan may be very different from an Arsenal, given the profile of debt that you have in the business. And so are we going to say to Everton, well, your interest rate is 10-15% within the fair market value calculation, but with Arsenal, we're going to say it's 5%. Is that what we're going to do? Or are we going to say there's one rate? Or is there going to be tiers? And it's going to be very difficult. Or is it going to be a proper fair market value? Now, if it's a proper fair market value, what would happen is there would be a process where any team that's got a shareholder loan has to make submissions as to what the fair market value should be. Anyway, the point is, until we see the rules, we don't know what they've agreed. We know some of the parameters around shareholder loans. We've seen some of that in the press release from the Premier League, but we don't know. So that's from the outside. From the inside, and between the parties, Premier League and Manchester City, they are waiting for a further determination of the tribunal. And that's going to be interesting, because if that tribunal, as I suspect, supports the Premier League's position that all the rules are valid effectively, and that they can make the changes that they made last Friday, then it may be for the Premier League a time to move on, because the Premier League might say, well, there's the final determination of the tribunal. Yes, we overextended ourselves in February of 2024. We've now rowed those back. We've introduced the shareholder loan provisions, and now we're fine. And it may be that if the tribunal kind of puts that forward, that they're correct. In the other scenario, that the tribunal says, hang on a minute, you can't just make the amendments that you're talking about. It's got to be a complete rewrite of APT. Well, then we've got a much more complicated situation, because then we're going to have a situation where the rules that they passed on Friday now need to be rewritten again. And then it's a decision for the Premier League. Now, you would think if that comes out of the tribunal, the Premier League say, well, of course, we'll have to make those changes. I think if they resist that in some way, or dispute what the tribunal actually says again, and you remember there was this dispute as to the extent of the tribunal's decision first time round. If there's a dispute there, then there is a risk that City then say, well, we are then going to litigate again and challenge this again. I think it's an unlikely scenario where both of those things are in play, i.e. one, that the tribunal says that the rules that you passed last Friday effectively are wrong, and two, they refuse to change them. I think that's the only scenario I can see where in this particular matter, City get involved in litigation again. But that's the next key step. Once we get that, then we'll see a bit more. I think it's interesting that we've got no, and maybe we wouldn't see it publicly, I don't know. Everything's meant to be confidential, but I think it probably would have leaked out if City would have said, well, we don't agree with what happened last Friday. We are actually now going to seek a formal injunction from the tribunal pending their determination. Now, I don't think they've done that. I'm not even sure they could. The tribunal might say it does not have jurisdiction to consider that point. But we've heard nothing about that. But that would clearly be a sign of upping the ante on the whole scenario. So there's various things that could pan out. I suspect, all things being equal, I suspect that we will end up in a scenario where last Friday's changes are lawful and are the rules that we have going forward. I suspect, but we'll just have to wait for the final determination of that tribunal first.